Now that we've set the various attributes in the render settings window, we can move on to actually launching a batch render. Now before we launch the render, however, we do need to check one more thing. We need to figure out where the images or the movie is going to render to. Now what happens by default is Maya will render out, say, a series of still images into the images folder within the default project directory. And the project directory is selected by Maya until you change it. And if you're using a Windows system like I am, that's going to be somewhere within the users folder. You can pick a new project directory, however, and therefore have the images render out to a more custom location. You can do that by going up to File and going to Set Project. If I click Set Project, I'll get this browser. At that point, you can go and pick a folder which will become the new project directory. When I say project directory or project folder, it's really the same thing, folder directory, the same idea. In any case, I can go and pick one. So I'm going to go to my computer icon here, then go to my C drive, double click that, and I'm going to pick a new folder. Now, if there's not a folder that I like already, I can make a new one with this new folder button right here. But here's what I'm going to use, which is called Maya. So I'll click that folder, and that's listed under here for directory. Again, folder directory, the same thing. So once it's listed down here beside directory, I can click the Set button. As soon as I do that, that becomes a new default project directory. Or at least that'll be the project directory that Maya will use from that point forward until you change it again. So I'll hit Set. And since I'm doing this for the first time with this particular folder, it's going to give me this error. It says this location C/Maya does not contain a project definition. What Maya does is it creates a workspace.mel file in your project directory. And that mel file helps tell Maya how to start up, what its configuration will be, and what its directory structure will be for the project directory. So if you see this error message, what you can do is create a default workspace. And now create a brand new workspace.mel file in a default configuration, and then you can start using that project directory and start using Maya once again. So I'll hit the Create Default Workspace and continue to work. So now I've changed the project directory. So let's take a look outside Maya. I'm going to bring in a Windows folder window so we can take a look. And here's my C drive. If I double click that and go in deeper, here's the Maya folder. And there's a new workspace.mel file. So I'm going to put this aside. The only thing you can do is go back to File and go back to Set Project. If you want to change it, you can pick another folder. Go ahead and click Cancel there. Another thing you can do is go down to File, Recent Projects, and these will be projects that were set previously. So you can pick one that was used at an earlier time if you want to. The third thing you do is go to Project Window. The project window will list the directory structure that will build based on that project directory. So what Maya will do is add additional subfolders when it needs to for various operations. For instance, if it's going to render out some images, it'll use a folder called Images. So your project directory might be Maya, but it will build additional subdirectories or subfolders within the one you selected for various renders, various temporary files, and whatnot. Again, this is Project Window. If you want to, you can change the various subfolders or just leave them at the default. That's fine. Again, if you want to take a look at that, if you're using Maya 2012, just go to File, Project Window. So now we know we have a custom project directory, so we can go and find our renders once we render. Let's try a batch render. Now, of course, we have to make sure that all the settings in the render settings window are correct. And this one's already been set up to render out a file name called test, targa format, frame padding of 2, 60 frames. On the Maya Software tab, there's also highest quality. So we can go ahead and render at this point. So if I go to the rendering main menu, I can go to render, and there's batch render right there. So I'm going to go ahead and click batch render. Now, you don't see anything right away, but what will happen is in the script window and also the status line down here at the bottom, they'll tell you what the program's doing. And what it's doing is launching the render externally. You're not going to see it in the render view window, you're going to see it right here in terms of a message about what it's doing. You can also open up the script editor, and there's a shortcut right here at the bottom right. If I click that button, I get the script editor. I'll scale that down a bit. And what that will do is it'll print out what it's doing in terms of the render. Now this render went really fast. There's not much in it, just this ball bouncing. And in fact, I've gone back to the ball_fall scene file, which is in the chapter 10 folder. So there's not a lot of geometry, and it's very simple animation. It actually rendered out really quick. But what happens is they'll render out one frame at a time. And they'll tell you its progress. They'll tell you the percentage of each frame as it finishes each frame. And since it went so fast, this printed out really, really fast. Eventually it gets to the last frame, like right here on frame 60. And what I can do is scroll through those messages here with this bar on the right side of the script editor. At the very end of rendering, it's going to say rendering completed down here at the bottom. Another useful thing about going to the script editor is you can see exactly where it's rendered out. And as I mentioned, it's going to create a subfolder for you by default. So if you pick C/Maya as your project directory, it's going to make an images folder, and that's where it likes to put images by default. So in this case, my renders went to C:/Maya/images/ the name of the actual file I rendered out. And the last one of that series is test.60.tga. Again, if you want to get to this window, there's a shortcut right here at the bottom right for the script editor. And anything that's happening in Maya that's a common task, like rendering or any other operation you might do, I'll read out here. And the last line of this readout, or the most recent one, is what appears down here in the status line. You can see how it matches. Rendering completed here, and that's the last thing printed out right here. So this little status line is a little tiny window into the script editor. So now I rendered that scene out. I can go back to my Windows folder. I'll bring that back in. Here I'm looking inside that folder. This is the C Maya folder here. I'm using Windows 7, although this will be similar with other versions of Windows. And there's my images folder. And Maya created that for me once I launched the render. I can go into that. And here's my series of targets. And as you can see, they're individual images numbered from 1 down to 60. Now, you can't look at those all together by default. If you were to click one, you'd get whatever program reads that by default in your system. In my case, it'd launch Photoshop. I could just look at one frame at a time. That's fine if you want to check the render and make sure individual frames are okay. If you want to look at them as an actual movie where it plays back, you have to go to some external program like QuickTime. If you have QuickTime Pro, you can load in a series of images and play them back. Or an external compositing program like After Effects, you can bring them all in as a series and then play them back. Or what we can do if you don't really have access to one of those programs is open up this series inside Maya and take a look. There's a way to do that through fcheck. I'm going to talk about that in a later video. But just for now, I'll go ahead and move this window away. Just for now, if you want to launch a batch render when you're ready, just go to Render, Batch Render. Now, if you decide that you want to cancel your render at some point, you can cancel if it's ongoing. If you're right in the middle of the render, say it's a much more complex render and you want to stop it, you can go to Cancel Batch Render. It'll kill the current frame. If you're rendering a series of frames, all the earlier frames will be okay. The current one will be dead. You'll have to re-render it later. Then you can always relaunch your batch render later to finish. If you do that, you simply have to remember to go back to your render settings window and put in the correct start frame and end frame. If you broke the render or canceled it halfway through, you can always say go in here and say, well, I want to start it again. Let's start from frame 30 and go to the end. So you can choose your range. And if you want to batch render in small groups of frames, 1 to 10 with one batch render, wait for that to stop, and then render out 11 to 20, whatever works in your situation.